Hello, I'm Dr. Maria Ritzema, and I teach history for College of DuPage. I am a scholar of South Asia, the world, and imperialism and decolonization. I teach most of the world history classes at College of DuPage, as well as most of the Asian history classes. And today I want to talk about China as a world power and the history of China being a world power. We actually know more about China than any other society on earth because they've been writing their own histories for the past couple thousand years. Now, most of us in the West don't know about this. China is kind of an unknown to us, but amongst themselves, they've been writing histories since the Han Dynasty. One of the greatest historians, probably the world's first historian, was Sima Qian. And he wrote a book called The Records of the Grand Historian. Now, he was writing in the Han Dynasty, and that's the first dynasty I kind of want to talk about. They ruled from about the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century of the current era. So they had a stable 400-year ruling time. And this is at the same time that Rome is kind of at their height over in the West. And the Han Dynasty sent out embassies, as they called them. These were kind of missions that would go out to seek trading partners, to see what other people had. And under the Han, they sent out Zhang Qian, who went on several missions or embassies and actually met up. He went through Central Asia. He went through several routes there. And he's kind of establishing what would come to be known as the Silk Road. So these were several routes by land and then later by sea, where China would send out trade goods to other places and try to get goods in return. In Roman times, Chinese embassies were going all the way to Rome. Chinese emperors were wearing Roman emperors were wearing Chinese silks. And even though this trade was happening, it's still at a low level. I mean, when we think about it, these are great distances that have to go mostly over land. And so the trade was not wide. And while there were curiosities and some nice gems and hides and metals and other things that were coming into China from abroad, for the most part, China felt that they were far ahead of these other societies. And so that they were, why would they need to go out constantly? If people wanted things, they should come to them. So, and during the Han period, already China is trading, in the known world. The next major dynasty that comes along is the Tang Dynasty. And this is from about 618 to 917. So it's around the early 7th century to the early 10th century of the current era. And this is often referred to as China's golden age, or second golden age if you consider the Han Dynasty the first golden age. And during the Tang Dynasty, their capital of Chang'an, which is today's Xi'an, was huge. It probably had over 1 million residents. It may have had 2 million residents. And there were tens of thousands of foreigners living in Chang'an. In Chang'an, you could find people from all over the place. You could find Persians, you could find Jews, you could find Muslims, you could find Indians, you could find Africans from the East African coast, the Swahili coast, besides Koreans, Japanese, Southeast Asian people, all living in Chang'an, because this was a cosmopolitan city. It was like the Chicago of its day, where, it had things that people wanted, and people wanted to be at the center of this vibrant cosmopolitan civilization. You could find foreign restaurants. You could find foreign bars with foreign liquors served. There are records of Indian shopkeepers and street meat sellers where you could buy Indian treats and desserts out on the street. You could find Persian waitresses. You could find Western musical instruments. And all this flourishing because merchants and monks and travelers and pilgrims were all coming across these Silk Roads again to come into Chang'an and to kind of experience the splendor of China. And we know a lot about Chang'an and the Tang Dynasty and all it had to offer because of a Chinese poet, Li Po, or sometimes Li Bao, as you sometimes see him. And he was he's one of the most prolific Tang poets, but he also is a prolific drinker. And so he participated and spent a lot of time in these foreign bars and restaurants and wrote of his times there. And often he lost a little money. He wasn't very good at holding on to his money, and then he would often write about it. And from the Tang, there's cultural exchange taking place. Goods are coming in from outside, and then Chinese goods are going out. And this is all kind of just building up the reputation of China as the place for luxury goods. After the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty comes in, and while they don't kind of hold on to power as long as the Tang did, they did continue this commercial revolution, this economic revolution, to try and build up Chinese prestige and power. The Song Dynasty fell to the Mongols, who established the Yuan Dynasty. And normally when we think of the Mongols, we think, oh, destruction and terror, and they're going out and pillaging and conquering and tearing everything down. But when Kublai Khan established the Yuan Dynasty in China, he was a reformer, and he actually protected the Silk Roads. He wanted to make sure that all travelers going on the Silk Roads would be safe, and he wanted to make sure that people could come to China to get the goods that they wanted, and that then if China wanted, they could get some of their the outside goods. So there was a lot of cultural exchange taking place, and especially under the Yuan Dynasty, with the other Mongols controlling the rest of Central Europe and into Western Europe, fame of Chinese products is spreading. And now silks, teas, porcelain, that's getting into Europe more and more. And so now Europeans are getting aware. And so Marco Polo, this is when he and his family travel to China under Kublai Khan, when he's ruling, to come and see the splendors of China. Marco Polo writes about how he's never seen anything like the cities in China, that Chengdu, their capital, is just, he's never seen such splendors before. And the Mongols would issue passes to the merchants and monks to travel throughout the empire. And this meant that they didn't need to carry money, that they could just show their pass, and this gave them access to a place to stay, to meetings with merchants, meetings with government officials, and the protection of the government. And when Marco Polo went back, he wrote his travels. This was a bestseller of the time. And so more people became aware of China and wanting somehow to reach China and to get more of these Chinese goods. Chinese power before modern times probably hits its height in the early Ming Dynasty. This is from 1368 to about 1644. And during the Ming Dynasty, the Emperor Ju Di, who becomes the Yongle Emperor, he has his trusted servant Zheng He, who has been with him since he was a child. He was a slave, captured, but he served his master well, and he rose up in the ranks, and he becomes an admiral. So the Yongle Emperor builds a navy, and he sends out Zheng He to the rest of the world. And these are called the Baoshuan. These were treasure ships. The largest ships were over 200 feet long. They dwarfed the contemporary Portuguese caravel. They could hold 1,000 men. Besides these large treasure ships, then there were hundreds of other smaller ships that went along with these that would carry horses, men, water tankers, gardens. Like some of these ships were big enough to hold their own gardens. And these treasure ships went out between 1405 and 1433, about 60, 70 years before the Portuguese and later the Spanish. And they went through the South China Sea, they went through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean, so visiting all ports of Southeast Asia, into India, Sri Lanka, then up the west coast of India, they went into the Straits of Hormuz, so they went into the Persian Gulf, down to the Swahili coast of Africa, showing the Chinese might, showing the Chinese flag. They're almost building a maritime empire. They could have started colonizing everywhere right then, but for the most part, the trade was peaceful. They would show all of their luxury goods, and then they would get some exotic things like frankincense or rhino horn or ivory from elephants, and bring this back to China. And probably one of the most exotic goods they brought back was a giraffe. And so when Zheng He brought the giraffe back, the Yongle Emperor rushed out to greet this, because for the Chinese, it reminded them of the mythical qilin, a mythical beast that only appears in the most auspicious times. And so this was perfect. This shows that the Chinese are the greatest power on earth, that the mythical beast, the qilin, has, taken it upon itself to show up during the Ming Emperor's time. However, shortly after these trips, there were a lot of internal problems in China. And so the treasure voyages were seen as frivolous, as wasting the government's money, as evidenced by they're not bringing back anything that we have or that we want. You know, we have everything we need. They're just bringing back curiosities. So we don't need to go to the world. If the world wants Chinese goods, they can come to China. And that's what happened. So later on during the Ming Dynasty, Europeans start showing up, mostly Jesuit kind of missionaries at first, and trying to, you know, convert people, but also exchanging goods. And the Europeans kept coming. The next great dynasty is the Ching Dynasty, and this is from 1644 to 1911, really. And during this dynasty, China is still mostly kind of internal facing. It's not sending out as many missions. It's not really visiting anyone else, but more and more people are coming to China to visit. They still want the goods. Europeans want that porcelain, they want those silks, and they want those teas, and especially the British. The British have developed a real taste for tea, and they're actually, by the 17th century, the 18th century, they've become addicted to tea. They are paying for, you know, tens of thousands of tons of tea per year. And when I say they're paying for it, they have to pay in cash. The Chinese are like, you don't have anything we want. We don't want your chintzy manufactured goods. We make better goods ourselves. If you want our tea, if you want our porcelain or china, then you have to pay cash for it. So where's all this cash coming from? Well, as we know, by this time, the Europeans have discovered the New World, which has, you know, vast amounts of silver. And so a lot of the silver that you would think would maybe go back into Europe is actually, most of it is going to China or India to pay for those luxury goods. And by the end of the 18th century, the British are desperate to find a trade good to trade for the tea instead of paying all of their silver. You know, they're cash poor. And in 1792, they send George Macartney, an emissary, to the Chinese court to try to establish an embassy at Beijing and to see if there are other goods that they could trade for the tea. And the Emperor Qianlong responds in this way: "The various articles presented by you, O king, this time are accepted by my special order in consideration of the offerings having come from a long distance with sincere good wishes." And then he goes on, and you can see the quote that, you know, but you can see there's nothing that you have that we want. You know, we'll take them this time, but next time just bring your cash. So in 1792, China is still in power. He can snub King George III. He can turn away the British emissary. He knows he has the power, and the British know he has the power. But this is about to change. Again, there starts to be several internal problems, natural disasters, peasant rebellions that the emperors have to keep dealing with. And so it takes their focus away from the world. Meanwhile, the British have discovered that opium grows very well in their new colony of India. And so they just try. They're like, I wonder if we can get the Chinese to accept opium for tea. And they do. And so they keep bringing in more and more opium. But opium is illegal in China. And the Chinese emperor are like, why are you bringing in this illegal drug? Stop doing this. But more and more opium is coming in, which drives the prices down, which means that more and more Chinese people are becoming addicted to opium. And so even though the British know it's illegal, they're like, well, who are we to stop the people from, you know, wanting opium? If they want it, we should just give it to them. Finally, you know, and this involved corrupt Chinese officials too, who are kind of taking a cut in, you know, taking bribes and a cut of the profits to let the opium come in. But finally, there's a commissioner who wants to do his duty. And so he destroys a ship full of British opium, who the British then use this as a pretext to invade. And then they bring in their new industrial powered steamships and blast their way along the south coast and blast their way up the Yangtze River, where they then, you know, kind of force the Chinese to give them treaty ports. They force them to give them terms of trade. They actually make China pay for the war. And then they start establishing their presence. And then other Europeans come in and threaten, we're going to do the same thing unless you let us come in as well. And this kind of starts the century of humiliation. So kind of the mid-19th to the mid-20th, when China has been knocked down from its world status power, and it has now been kind of humiliated, as they see, by the West. After the century of humiliation, China's main goal was to try to reclaim what they saw as their place at the top. That, they knew they had been a world power for most of their history, for a couple thousand years, and their goal was to reclaim that and to kind of pay back against this century of humiliation. So most of their economic goals was to industrialize quickly, to reform their economy, to get their economy taking off, and to build their power. In the late 80s and early 90s, the architect of this economic reform was Deng Xiaoping, who is most known for his quote that they were going to have socialism with Chinese characteristics, meaning that they were going to adapt socialist ideas, but they were going to adapt it to the local attitudes and factors in Chinese society. And he realized that if they wanted their economy to grow, they needed to reform it. And so it's under Deng Xiaoping that they kind of do away with a lot of Mao's policies, and they kind of start opening up to private enterprise. And it's still directed, the economy would still be directed by the state, but there would be more private initiative. And so under Deng Xiaoping, we have the new Shenzhen in Guangdong province, the special economic zone, and this is where Shanghai is. And they're going to allow new trade deals, and they're going to seek out foreign investment to help build this up. You also have the Pudong New area, which was going to build and grow. And these new policies really helped the Chinese economy take off. From the early 90s until now, it just keeps shooting up and up and up. And one of the things that the current president, Xi Jinping, is trying to do is he wants to keep that going, but he is finally ready to turn more outward and use the rest of the world to also further not only Chinese economic development, but further development elsewhere. And so part of his new kind of statecraft is to invest in other places. So invest in development in Latin America and in Africa and in places like Sri Lanka. And so this ends up replacing a lot of previous American investment or European investment. And this is where a lot of the tensions in the world in terms of economics and politics start happening, is because China is now kind of taking the place of previous so-called Western investment. And it's worked for them. They have built up their economy. They are building up other projects and economies, are helping do so in Latin America and in Africa. And, they see this as helping them kind of reclaim that top spot. I don't think China is trying to bust up the existing international system. It's done well for them. They don't want to ruin that. They just want to take over their previous top spot. They see that kind of as their rightful place in the world. And they're doing it right now. They're the world's second largest economy, and probably in a couple decades, they will be the top spot again, as they have been for the past 2,000 years. So I hope this kind of brief look at China's kind of high points and how they see themselves and how the rest of the world saw them and their economy and their fabulous goods that they produce gives you a better idea of Chinese attitudes and their worldview now, so that we can understand what's happening. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope everyone stays safe out there.